This is the SpeakOut campaign, a youth initiative dedicated to promoting public speaking and civic engagement. We interview prominent speech and debate competitors, along with various youth voices and activists. Today, we'll be speaking with Max Belyantsev, DECA Chapter President and a self-published author. We'll be discussing his experience with campaigning for his state DECA election, growing local initiatives, and the process of writing and publishing his book. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Hi, Max. Really excited to get to talk to you today. How are you doing right now?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good. You can see that I'm wearing a sweater as we're moving into the colder weather. But for everyone else, Max Belyantsev is a high school senior just like me, and he's passionate about business, writing, and philosophy, and is dedicated to serving his local community in meaningful contexts. He is a chapter president at Richard Montgomery High School DECA, the *1 chapter in Maryland. Wow. Over the years, he has pioneered a training program that led his chapter to success with a 70% and over 70% qualifying rate for DECA's International Career Development Conference, ICDC, as many people might know it. He is passionate about writing and is an editor-in-chief at his student-led newspaper, The Tide, where he has established record-keeping practices, introduced the new science and tech section, and led the production of all print issues and online or multimedia content since June 2023. He is a president at his school's philosophy club, where he hosts bi-weekly meetings to create a safe space for exploring difficult topics. He's also in the final stages of publishing his book, From My Mind to Yours, in which he discusses effective strategies for teenagers to live a more thoughtful and fulfilling life. In college, Max hopes to study economics and also take courses in English literature, philosophy, psychology, and government. So lots of stuff going on there, as to be expected. But I really like that you have all these different interests and you're very involved in each of them as well. So I noticed that a lot of this also centers around community service and also speaking and the written word. So can you tell me what your first public speaking experience was?
Sure. So, I would say my first experience actually would happen to be through DECA last year, when I ran for Maryland DECA State President. It was my first experience ever campaigning. And so that involved, creating campaign materials, writing speeches, practicing them, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, of course, reading them out the day of, that event. And I would say, funny story, I think I drank something like 7 caffeinated teas that day before I realized oh wait, maybe I should switch to decaf. It's crazy. Apparently I was rambling through the whole thing. So yeah, it was nonetheless though, I would say it was definitely a good experience. I am very passionate about DECA. I've been doing it for years, and I really do believe in its value that it brings, in learning, not only just learning about business, but also developing a lot of these soft skills and, important other skills that you would use in the future for just about any discipline you can imagine. And so, yeah, I wrote my speech, practicing it, in front of the mirror, all this other stuff. And then, of course, reading it out to the delegates who would vote, a pretty large space. As is the first time for anything, it can be a little nerve-wracking, sure. But I, did my best to power through it, and the caffeine helped, although hopefully, didn't take away too much because, I think I had one of my advisors come over and tell me that I was speaking with a lot of vigor, which is, kind of interesting, but, so that was kind of funny, I think. But yeah, overall, that was a great experience for me. And then actually just before that, I had the pleasure of serving as a director of communications and public relations for my county's SMOB, which is a student member of the Board of Education. And so I served his campaign, in that role, and I basically revised his speeches, suggested effective communication strategies, public speaking, things like that. Created event or news briefings and things like that. And overall, that was also a really great experience where I wasn't necessarily in the spotlight, but I got a lot more experience in the behind the scenes of, what public speaking actually is. How do you write a speech and how do you make it effective? How do you make it, fill it more with, a breadth of content as opposed to just saying the same thing over and over? How do you keep that concision up, but also make it really meaningful? And there is a really good balance that, we strive to strike in that regard. So that was really helpful for me to sort of, it's my first, I guess you could say, trial run on the back end, which I would then go on to use at the DECA State campaign. So yeah, those would be my first experiences with public speaking.
Amazing. It seems like you've got a really good mix of just a holistic view on what exactly public speaking is. And I can totally attest to how nerve-wracking it can be to run for positions because I'm very involved with TSA and I did the exact same thing. And yeah, it's really scary to be up there and, have that in the back of your mind that if you mess up, like, hey, this might affect me later down the road. But at the same time, you do want to take risks and show everyone what you're all about. But I also find it really interesting that you got to be part of SMOB and get that other side on public speaking, since I think that's something that not a lot of students get to do. So, in kind of a two-part question here, can you tell me what it was like to be in that role, like what the day-to-day is? How involved were you with that in that director role? And also, what did you learn about how to craft a good speech? Because a lot of times I feel like it's hard to strike a good balance between maybe anecdotal stuff and also getting your platforms or facts across.
Right. That's a great question. So I think, so my role as a director of comms and PR, it was, I would say, fairly flexible, mostly because in the beginning campaign stages, you work around the school day. You're still getting, ramping things up. But yes, so that would mean, I spend probably a few hours a week doing that, communicating with my team, getting our materials ready, making sure we know what we're doing, and stuff like that. So you're right. You're absolutely right in the sense that it is hard to strike a balance between anecdotes and, the real, the real content within. And so in terms of just speeches in general, I've found that, you got to have a very strong beginning and a very strong ending. The middle part, that's where a lot of the content lies, but you want to be an effective speaker right from the second you begin, and especially when you finish. Because that is what most people remember. If you have something really inspirational at the end, that's what's going to stick around in people's minds. Not necessarily, the details and the little things that, are obviously important for, the person who might be particularly involved in or, knows what's going on in that regard. But for most people, it's important to, start off strong, present yourself as somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who's confident, somebody who says, hey, this is me, this is what I'm doing, this is why I care about this. Then you can go into the details, and then you finish off with saying, why this is important, and really just sort of create a narrative that starts with you, but ends with the idea that you're going for. I find that ultimately that's the way to go. Because when you're running for a position like a student member of the board, it's not really about you. It's about what you're doing. It's about your service to the county. And so my county, which is Montgomery County Public Schools, the SMOB currently represents something like 160,000 students. It's a lot of students, right? And it's certainly, a role that looks outwards at the students. And so we want to make sure that, when we start writing the speech, we want to make sure that you start from a good point, but you also end it in that same kind of way where you're looking outwards at the students and saying, let's do this, let's make our county better. It's, this is important, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I would say between anecdotes and content, I would say, I can't really give you a number, but what I would comment on that is basically with anecdotes, you want to have a few in there. You want to be relatable, right? It's something, when you run for any kind of political office, you want to make sure that you're not kind of the sore thumb like sticking out too much, in the sense where it's like, it makes it a little bit difficult to relate to this person, who is supposed to be representing me, but they're just like in their own little world doing this and that. It's like, okay, but how does that really affect me? And so bringing in your personal experiences, especially like when you're, as this mob was, when he was involved in a lot of, other student government, political, student political groups, things like that. He really had that firsthand experience of like, okay, I'm in this county. I am a student in this county, right? What am I experiencing? What do I not like about this? What are other students telling me? Like, what are they kind of upset about? And having that experience can also really help with those anecdotes and, creating that relationship, which is also, I think, pretty important at the beginning of the speech, because you want to establish yourself again, as you would kind of as, a team player, but also somebody who's advocating for the students and not for themselves. Right. Yeah.
Definitely. And I really like how you point that out about having that anecdote at the start and then ending with a call to action, since I think that's just a really good structure for lots of people. And it's something that never really fails. I use it in almost all of my speeches. And it's really powerful in just helping you come across not only as genuine, since you're starting off with giving a personal connection, but also finding that balance in between like the platforms that you're trying to go for and your experience. Because sometimes I think, especially when you're campaigning, it can be difficult to get those connections, but then also not sell yourself short, since, as you said, it's hard to be relatable and genuine sometimes, but you also want to show that you have the qualifications. And I think it's good to start out by connecting with people first and then getting more into the qualifications, instead of coming out like, hey, I won all these things and I have all these accomplishments. So yeah, great advice on there, Max. And because you've been so involved with DECA, can you tell me about how all of that got started and what your experience has been leading your chapter?
Absolutely, sure. So, my DECA journey started my sophomore year. So, we're both seniors, right? I assume we had our freshman year virtually, if you may recall. And it was, frankly, I wasn't really involved in a lot of clubs back then. It was just wasn't the time for me. But in 10th grade, when I got to school in person, things were ramping up. I was walking around my, club fair that my school hosts once a year. I saw DECA. I've always been kind of interested in business at that point. I was like, oh, seems kind of cool, right? Like, I'll probably work for a business in the future. Like, might as well. So I signed up, and, nothing much was going on. And then I saw one of my friends who I didn't know was going to, become one of my close friends at that time. But I saw him on his phone checking like his stocks, checking his trading account and seeing how things are going. I'm like, okay, that looks pretty cool. And so I walk up to him and I'm like, hey, what is that? Are those stocks? And he's like, yeah. And then we started talking about, stock trading. I'd had a little bit of interest in that earlier on in my life. And so kind of getting that reminder was kind of fun for me. And eventually we went on to do, to work together in our DECA competitive events. And we did financial services team decision making that first year, where it was a lot of like, hey, I have this much money, right? I make this much in income, I have this much saved, I have this many kids, blah, blah, blah. Like, what do I put my money into to achieve XYZ goal, right? And so right from the beginning, that experience with like, what stocks should I be trading? Should I be looking at stocks? Should I be looking at bonds, which are like, a different kind of investment tool, or, other tools that exist? What is the best strategy for me? And, these all have different levels of risk. And I just found that to be very, very intriguing. And so as like a jumpstart, that would basically jumpstart my kind of career in DECA, where I, competed that year as a sophomore in the regionals event, the state event, and then I went on to compete internationally in Atlanta, Georgia, which I thought was really fun, in that financial services event, doing those kinds of things. And I'd say that's how it all got started. But since then, I would say I'm thankful to have had a pretty fruitful career at my school's DECA chapter. I served as a director of training last year as a junior, where I developed this training program from scratch. So when I was a sophomore doing this finance event, I was like, the extent of our training was basically like, here are some Quizlets, and everything you don't know, like, just Google it, right? Like that. I personally, going through that myself, I'm like, okay, well, it kind of just like worked out for me, but it can be so much better than just that. And so I did end up, as a training director, I developed this, very comprehensive program with practice scenarios, sample exams, things like that, picking and pulling from places, on the internet, but also creating study guides and things like that from scratch. And overall, just putting it in like this accessible format, which was Google Drive for us. And just having it available to all of our members, I think that is partially what made a lot of the difference and what led our chapter last year. Out of the 75 something people that went to the state competition, over 50 of them qualified for internationals, which is, a huge jump up from the 30 the year prior. So just looking at those numbers, you see that immediately there is a big difference. When you give people the resources they need to succeed, that is empowering, right? Especially, because my first year, I mean, I think I just kind of got lucky in that regard. Like, I wasn't particularly an expert in finance or anything. And so, DECA, in a sense, it did teach me how to kind of think on my feet and how to kind of make the best of any situation. But of course, when, as the club, our club is growing year over year. And so I thought last year was really important to sort of nail that down and make sure that there's a system in place that can serve future years, so that we can, make sure our members kind of know what's going on. DECA is a very, if you're not familiar with it, it can be kind of confusing to anyone watching who might be interested. It's the best way I can explain it is it's essentially a mock consulting series of competitions. So, you're a consultant, you're solving a problem, right? When I market the DECA, I basically say what you're doing is you're solving puzzles, right? But like in a business environment. So you have this issue, your client comes to you, says, hey, what do I do about this? Now, obviously, it's very vague, right? So DECA has categories like marketing, management, hospitality, what else? Like entrepreneurship, and other things like that, finance.
Yeah, I
So
know business sports is one that is super popular with boys in my school.
yes, it is also very popular over here in Maryland. So yeah, it has a bunch of those different kinds of events, which, are applicable to a lot of real world situations, whether you're marketing, a product, or you're marketing, your abilities, or you're just talking about like, what knowledge you have and explaining concepts to people, all these speaking skills. You could call it public speaking, although in DECA it's usually like a one-on-one conversation. You do build those skills of like how to connect with a person. How do you kind of explain this topic in a way that's understandable, maybe in layman's terms, or just in other ways that you can both get your point across, but also, like I said, be relatable, make that connection. And so through my experience with DECA, I've been able to build up those skills pretty well. And so I'm thankful for that. But yeah, so sort of circling back to what I did last year. We did a lot of those new training programs, held a bunch of meetings. I also created a one-on-one ICDC training opportunity for our students. So they would book a time with me, and I would basically, they would present their event. They would just do a practice event, except in front of a real judge, it'd be in front of me. And so that way you kind of get that experience of like, okay, maybe I'm a little nervous, but it's not it's not as stressful as it would be on the real day. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense, where you really get a lot of constructive feedback out of that. And so that was my year, basically, as a junior. And then now I am serving my school's chapter as a president. And so for me, it's kind of just looked like basically marketing our club even more, increasing our membership. And in terms of registration, I believe our membership has jumped, or our projected membership has jumped by 50%, which is quite impressive, I think. And it's definitely a result of just, I think, word of mouth, but it's also a lot of the efforts we've put in last year and the success, our ICDC trip to Orlando, Florida had last year. And I am really happy to see things going this way. As I said, I think DECA is really, it can, when you take it seriously, I think you can really get a lot out of it. It's what I tell members. It's like the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. As a president, I think one of the hardest things I've had to do this year is sort of figure out how to work with other people that are pretty different from me, right? Like, I might have, one approach that I take to a lot of problems. I might be more assertive and somebody else, is a little bit more passive. And it's figuring out how to kind of create a system that works for you. So, for example, in leading my newspaper, I might take one approach or have one kind of way that maybe I'm like saying, hey, I want to do this. I want to do this, and you just kind of, you're, being incredibly active, while let's say with DECA, for example, you might need to take a different approach and say, okay, I'll do this part of it, you do this part of it, and kind of we'll come together and we can help each other out if we need to. But it's kind of like you could say like whether you take a 50-50 approach or like a 100-100 approach. I've found personally that it's different for different people. Now, usually I'm a 100-100 person. Like I'm just going to actively just do everything I can, go all out. But I realize that, sometimes it can get tricky, especially when you're running, a large team. Like we have a team of 14 officers and, I'm working closely with the DECA board, which is our presidents and vice presidents. That's 5 of us. And so, it really helps to have, in some cases, it helps to have, kind of those boundaries where you're like, hey, this is like what I'm good at. So I'd like to do this. This is, what I would rather spend my time doing. So let's figure out a way to make that happen. So yeah, and I would say, I wouldn't have gotten that experience had I not kind of risen up through like those DECA ranks and gotten to the place where I am now, because it has taught me something about how to, as I said, work with people that, I wouldn't have really been able to work with otherwise, but also in a meaningful context by bringing, business into the forefront, especially like at my school, the closest you would get to a business class is economics. And, it's definitely a little bit more math focused and not as much, on the like humanities side, like, management or how do businesses work, and broader kind of, kind of applied economics, you could say, management, things like that. Like there's not really much covered there in school, in classes. And so DECA is a great way to get into the side of business that most people will probably actually experience. You might not become like, an economist and know all of these technical things or remember any of them past high school, but you will remember like, hey, this is how I should pitch this idea. If I think, if I think like this project isn't going in the right direction, how do I be respectful about it, but also pitch my solution? How do I explain to somebody else, this concept that I know a lot about, but they might not know too much about, in a way that's effective, but also concise. And DECA is able to bring that to a lot of people, and I'm happy that it's bringing it to an increasing amount of people at my school. And so, yeah, those are just a few of my experiences with DECA.
Yeah, amazing. And again, I just want to echo what I mentioned earlier that, yeah, all of this is super impressive. And I really enjoy how you were able to identify areas, for instance, with organizing your Google Drive and making those resources accessible, because a lot of times it's not necessarily that there isn't enough information, right? Because there's so much for DECA out there, but it's putting all of that information in a way that people can access and digest it. And that's what really allows them to grow. Since if you just put all that in front of them, they're not going to know how to understand all of it. So I really enjoy how you were able to identify that part and make a difference for the better. And I mean, all of that
Absolutely.
success with your chapter is very well deserved. And something that I always like to ask people who are in DECA, especially if they've gone to ICDC, is if they have any fun stories from that. Because just from my experience with going to national conferences, not everything always goes to plan. So did you have anything to add on that?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Okay. So yeah, the experiences I've had at ICDC have both been quite pleasant overall. When I was a sophomore, it was held in Atlanta, Georgia, and as a junior, it was held in Orlando, Florida. Now, like one kind of takeaway from Atlanta I remember is basically one time one of our shuttles just didn't arrived to like take us from our hotel to a Georgia Aquarium and the Coca-Cola Museum down in downtown Atlanta. And that was kind of a big thing because, again, we had like, 30 kids from my chapter, but also like 20 other kids from Maryland just kind of around there. So like, what do you do? And so we had a lot of these students, these seniors. I was a sophomore back then, but there weren't any adults because our advisor unfortunately had to fly back for a medical reason, the like second day or something. So it was kind of just like the students were running things, right? And eventually, I think the way we got out of that pickle was, they somehow managed to get, 50 kids onto a metro, walking from our hotel to like the metro station, getting them on the metro, taking a few stops, like switching trains, get like this and all of this like nonsense, which is like, it's honestly really impressive. And it inspired me how they were able to like get 50 people, despite the fact that like the shuttle, which is like how we expected things to go, it just didn't arrive. So you have to deal with it. You have to, think on your feet and come up with a solution. And their solution worked out pretty well. Like we got to, the Coca-Cola Museum and Georgia Aquarium, which were like kind of right next to each other. Something like maybe half an hour to an hour late out of like the whole evening. So I would say like that's pretty solid. And yeah, so like, especially helping people like, if they didn't have like cash on them, like how are we going to get like their, metro like ticket or whatever. And so just a lot of that experience, I remember that vividly, and it was fun because, I guess at that point I was a member. I wasn't leading anything that first year. I was just there experiencing it. And, despite the fact that I'm sure it was, somewhat or quite stressful for those who were running things, for me, it was fun. I was like, hey, this is a cool experience, just like, it's liberating to some degree when some things don't go to plan. And the following year, I kind of got to experience the other side of that coin where we were in Orlando, Florida. It was like 10 p.m. On the night following the like welcoming ceremony, like presentation, whatever. And our advisors, like they were there, but nowhere to be seen. They'd probably already, taken the bus back or something like that to our hotel. But essentially we kind of got lost a little bit. So, this gigantic conference center with like 18,000 people there all scrambling to get to their buses at night. It's like kind of crazy, but it was like a group of 15 or something students. And I were kind of just like, we had found each other, but like we didn't really know where our shuttle was. We were like on the like opposite side of the building apparently. And just like, it was kind of confusing because we hadn't really thought about, establishing like a clear plan on how to like make it out of this gigantic conference center. So, we were together. It was kind of getting hectic. Like, people, we were thinking about ways to kind of, get ourselves out of that situation. And so, I was suggesting like, there's kind of this large hall that goes around the perimeter of the building. So I'm like, okay, let's just take what's like clear and visible and just like the safe route, you could say. Just take that and, we'll get there eventually. Like, we'll make it. It's like, last shuttles in like half an hour, 45 minutes. Like there are definitely ways we could have made that, I think. But, and then we had other suggestions where things like, the leading one was where basically there's this shortcut through this giant dark, like, I don't know, conference hall or whatever that was just empty. And like, obviously like it was kind of, it's like when it's not in use, so it's like closed, but the door's open. So like, it's that kind of thing. And to my surprise, one of the students in my group, while we were deliberating, actually sort of snuck out and went through that route because it went out to like this kind of outdoor loading dock thing that was like outside, but like you could get to the other end of the building. Anyway, wild.
Oh my gosh.
But basically, and then, so people heard from this person like, hey, I made it. And they're like, what? Like we should go that way. And I'm like, okay. So, time was running out. Things was like crazy. It's pretty crazy. And then I was like, okay, here's what we should do. Let's take, I'll take one group and we'll go the safe route. And, the other officers that were there, I'm like, I trust you guys, turn your location on just so I know where you are. If anybody gets hurt, I need to be the first to know and things like that. Just because even though I was a training director at the time, like there was nobody kind of like older than me, both in grade or in rank or like higher in rank there. So I was kind of like, I kind of imposed that responsibility among myself. And so I was like, okay, here's my phone number, like, here's like, share your location with me. Like, please tell me if anyone gets hurt. I trust you guys. You got this. Just, be safe. And eventually, so they made it, admittedly before me, right? Because, some sort of like shortcut type thing. But eventually, I got there with my group as well. And so at the end of the day, everybody was, safe and sound back at the hotel. But it was definitely a very wild experience, especially because, the first year I kind of experienced it as just somebody who was, following directions, right? And that's totally different from when you have to think on your feet and come up with those directions yourself, right? It's like a very, very different experience. And it was quite stressful for me, I'm not gonna lie. Like, it's just because when you have that responsibility, and there's also like, a strict curfew, especially because it's like, that was the policy for our DECA chapters from Maryland. We had a curfew, and that was approaching, and the last shuttle, and blah, blah, blah. And there's all these different stresses and factors that are just, kind of, blowing your face, and you're like, what do I do about this? And it really helped to sort of just step back for a second, think, and, communicate with some of my other officers, and like, okay, you know what, like, here's what we should do, because, I'm going to be completely honest, like, I don't think I was convincing them, and they were not really convincing me of any like 100% like perfect solution, which, looking back on that moment, I don't think there was, right? It's like, you want to take kind of, so I was thinking in the moment, I was like, okay, so this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. Let's do some kind of compromise, right? Let's make sure that we do something rather than nothing, because then just sitting there wouldn't have helped, I think, at all. So by doing that compromise eventually, and giving my fellow officers who led the other group through the shortcut the tools they needed to kind of do it safely and do it right, that kind of helped me, it taught me to sort of be more flexible, especially because I'm a planner. Like, I love to plan things. I love things going to plan, and kind of being very detailed about that. And so when things get derailed, it's, you're obviously kind of just left on your own trying to come up with something new, but something that works. And so fundamentally, that experience taught me to kind of be flexible, go with the flow, but also communicate with others, make compromises. And overall, as I said, thankfully everything worked out. And so again, that being the first night, or, one of the first nights of the conference, people were still kind of getting a hang of the space. Later on, nothing like that really happened. Everybody was sort of able to figure things out. But yeah, that was a very, very wild night for me, and one that I think I'll remember for a very long time. But yeah.
Well, I'm happy that it all turned out all right, and it's really funny that you eventually got to get the best of both worlds and be on both sides of decision making.
Right.
But yeah, definitely does not fall short compared to all the other crazy stories. I think yours is definitely up there. And as we wrap up, can you just give me a couple of short responses on these next couple of questions? So I know you're also involved with Philosophy Club. How do you think that your discussions through that have maybe evolved or improved along the way?
Sure. So, my philosophy club at my school had our first two meetings recently, and we talked about Barbie, right? The new Barbie movie. And so we talked about the implications of feminism, and just sort of how the movie commented on those sort of things. Was it even, supposed to be political in the first place? Or, if it was, then what does that say about, gender roles, gender dynamics, things like that? And so, what I really, enjoyed about that experience is that everybody comes into it kind of with their own thoughts, their own kind of ideas, and everybody learns something, including myself, just having that space where you can talk about it. I think, it's, even though like philosophy club, like it's really just, you're meeting with your peers and you're talking about it, but because you call that space, a philosophy club or whatever other club, it could be, it sort of kind of creates this like de facto space where people feel a little bit more comfortable than they would just talking about it with their peers. And so I am really happy that kind of turned out the way it did. And yeah, so last year we definitely had, so I was a member last year, and this year I'm serving as the president of that. Last year we definitely had a lot of interesting discussions, but some that were, that were kind of difficult to grasp at first. When you get into very deep, thoughtful, philosophical ideas and concepts, it could be a little bit hard to digest at first. So this year I was like, let's take a different approach. Let's start off with something that's kind of more well known, maybe in pop culture or something like that. And so we landed on the Barbie movie. So I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. And we talked about it, and we had a great discussion that lasted not one but two meetings, because there was a lot to say. And overall, yeah, I learned a lot from that experience, and I can't wait to host even more discussions. Our upcoming topic is probably going to be something related to AI, right? We all know the never-ending news stories about ChatGPT, kids doing their homework using ChatGPT, blah blah blah. Deep fakes, AI voiceovers, whatever. Just all of these like crazy things. It's like, on one hand, technological advancement is can be really helpful in some contexts, but in other contexts, I think it's important that we take a second and think, okay, well, what does this actually mean for us? Like, what are the implications of creating deep fake AI, for example, or when it comes to like legislating AI, like, should we do that? Should the U.S. government do that? Should an international body do that? Should a company who's making the AI do that? Right? Like, how do we set up artificial intelligence in a way that makes that kind of decreases the negative possibilities of AI? And also, how do we, create a space where we can sort of slow down and just think about it, just talk it out before we continue making certain advancements that, could very well not be in our favor. And so one of the interesting things, I like that through this philosophy club, even just like high school students, we can sit around and really think about something, because, you can read that, oh yeah, this is true, AI is happening, but it's not always clear to make that second step to, okay, but should this be happening? Why is it happening? And I feel like that is, just as important, if not more important, than just the thing is happening itself. And
sure.
through Philosophy Club, it's a great way to start that discussion, where eventually future leaders, future, politicians, economists, I don't know, like business leaders, things like that, because we are the next generation, we are leading kind of the world into this new era, and so it's important that we kind of maintain this the idea of thinking things through. I think that's really important. It's something that I like to practice a lot, and it's important to me, and so I think Philosophy Club's a great way that we've been able to sort of help move that forward.
Definitely. And I really like that you're able to touch on these current issues, and it's not just stuff like, oh, who was Kant and Hobbes and all these things, because a lot of the time it's really these current issues that need more discussion, in comparison to simply going back and reiterating those things, since you're able to go then apply those fundamentals towards these issues and create more discussion. Since I agree with you, I think there's a major difference in between reading about all of these things that are happening and then actually taking time to dissect them and having that opportunity to discuss with other peers. You're able to get other opinions and maybe come up with a conclusion that none of you would have come up with before if you didn't have that conversation in the first
Right.
place. And I know right now you're working on publishing a book. So in a couple of sentences, can you give me a quick overview of what it's about and any struggles that you had with doing that, since that is a major feat?
Right. So my book is called From My Mind to Yours, and it's basically a collection of discussions where I talk about strategies on, that I've used kind of in my personal life to, I guess, try and live, a more thoughtful, a more fulfilling life. And there's a lot that encompasses. I talk about how it's important to kind of accept uncertainty and where its value lies in the world. Like, for example, with with what I just talked about things not going to plan, right? You can't be certain of anything really, but there's also kind of, I think, a positive takeaway from just about anything. And so accepting that, accepting your faults, right? Like nobody is really perfect, but that doesn't mean that you should maybe like not strive towards it. You definitely can, as long as you just keep in mind and be mindful of the fact that, nobody is perfect, like no matter what they seem, like even if it's on the outside. And so it's important to accept, acknowledge your own faults, but also be accepting of others. And that's kind of one of the main themes that I've carried on through the book. I talk about just kind of broadly like relationships and friendships, and for people that it might be a little scary to like meet new people, interact, like kind of just bringing a more like friendly, approachable tone to the fact that like we're all human. Nobody is, again, like kind of perfect at anything, but here are a few ways that you can put yourself out there, do this, do that. I talk about self-determination and control. So I really personally, I'm a fan of like paradoxes. So for me it's like responsibility and freedom, and like controlling yourself or limiting yourself versus like freedom. I find that those two are like ultimately they kind of lead into each other in a way. It's in the sense that like if you had the freedom to like do whatever you wanted, then you just basically become a slave to your desires. And that doesn't sound like a good idea of freedom to me, to be honest. It's like I would rather be free in the sense of like being able to control myself, being able to be disciplined, being able to like have these responsibilities, and of course that can mean, adding responsibilities or taking away responsibilities depending on how I feel. But it's not just like, oh, I'm going to sit around watching Netflix all day because that's what I want to do, right? But I through the book I try to help kind of bring that to light, that hey, maybe we should like let's acknowledge that in some cases I think it is better to kind of discipline yourself and consider life from that perspective. And then I talk about axiology, which is like values, and basically just saying don't take things for granted, kind of think things through. So those are the overall themes, I would say. Generally it's like I want to encourage people to think more about the things they do. Like it's easy to live life on autopilot. You wake up for school, you go to school, you scroll, on your phone like the whole day, then you leave, and you go do your homework and whatever. And I think that, life is a beautiful thing, but it's something that, at the same time, you should take it, kind of live actively and think critically about everything, because everything, there's always something that you could think is a good thing to do and something that's not. And so it's important to be able to distinguish the two. And yeah, so yeah, with that context, I just hope to provide some of my personal experiences on those topics.
Well, yeah, good luck on that process, and I look
Thank you.
forward to eventually reading it. All of that sounds really, really interesting. And after all these discussions we've had, if you could sum up your entire public speaking or just community engagement journey in one word or phrase, what would that be and why?
All right. So, I would say, just beginning, right? So I think I have had some experiences in public speaking, right? Whether it's through DECA, running for state president, or just doing competitions. It's definitely kind of public speaking presentation skill that I have developed through that. But I recognize kind of the importance of speaking your mind, especially at a time when it's really easy to sort of kind of just be silent on a lot of issues that you might have an opinion about, and that nobody's opinion is necessarily worth more or less than yours. It's not about it's about the argument you're making. And so I think that for that reason, I definitely want to continue and be more involved in public speaking, whether that means on a club level, or whether through it's like an interest in government or politics or economics, and just sort of creating meaningful change. I think that public speaking is a really big part of that, because public speaking, can help motivate people to sort of create a better world when you put the argument, in a good way.
Of course. And it was really great to get all of your input on these different ideas. I'm sure a lot of people can take away some really beneficial things from all of this, whether it's with campaigning or serving their community, or even just reframing how they think about what they're doing in their lives. So, yeah, thank you so much for being on here today, Max.
Thanks, Ariel, for having me. It was a great discussion.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you have any comments, questions, or emotional outbursts, feel free to follow the SpeakOut campaign on Instagram at speakout_speech and our website, speakoutspeech.org. See you in the next episode.